I'm Sara Calvo from SIPA, teaching at SIPA. And I'm delighted to have you here and to have this prestigious panel. I think the big audience we have here reflects, or it's a reflection on the importance of this topic. What's going on in the world affects us, all of us, in different ways. I must say, there isn't one morning that I get up and get the Financial Times and try to guess what's going to happen with my savings and my retirement. And I guess some of you probably have debts or also worried about your savings. So it's not only we are living in a volatile global environment, we are living in a home volatile environment, I would say, too. So today the focus of the seminar is the G20. I don't know if you know that there was a recent meeting in Mexico, because Mexico now has the presidency. But let me say first, do you all know what the G20 is? You do? No need to say anything, but let me just review a little bit. 20 members, you're right, absolutely. Made of minister and central bank governors of the 20 major economies, 19 countries plus the European Union. And this group of people represent more than 80% of the global gross GDP and 80% of world trade. And it's something that started, I would think, as a consequence of the Mexican crisis, although at that time the name was different, Financial Stability Forum. And also at that time, it didn't go very far. There was no framework to discuss these issues, and nothing happened then until the Asian crisis. So people started worried about contagion. So everybody started thinking, well, in this globalized world, we need to start talking among each other. And that's how this started. And I believe that since 2009, it has replaced the meeting of the G8. So now it's not only the advanced countries that are getting together, but also together with the people from emerging markets. And the idea is to come up with recommendations in order to make the world better. Difficult task. In the last meeting, they committed to several actions, specific actions, including issues related to exchange rates, commodity prices, commodity volatility, commodity price volatility, financial stability, etc. So that brought a broad description of what the G20 do. So the idea today is to talk about the G20 expectations and to exchange views on how realistic are these expectations and what tools do you have. Not much has happened since all this discussion started, so I'm afraid we're not going to come out with solutions today, but we hope we're going to have a good discussion. So we're going to start with Mahmoud Mohieldin. Let me tell you a little bit about Mahmoud. He's the World Bank Group Managing Director, responsible for the bank knowledge development, represented through the networks and the World Bank Institute. Also, I don't know if you know the organization of the World Bank. The World Bank has a president, and below the president there are 3 managing directors. So Mr. Mohieldin is one of the managing directors. Prior to joining the World Bank, he held numerous positions in the government of Egypt and served in several boards of directors in the Central Bank of Egypt and the corporate sector. As a World Bank representative at the G20 deputy minutes, he oversees the bank's work in support of the G20 agenda. So nobody better than him to discuss these issues. a little more on his background. He was a professor of economics at Cairo University, has written several articles, and he has a PhD degree from University of Warwick. So I'm going to give the microphone to Mahmoud, and later on I'm going to introduce the other two speakers as they start talking.
Hi. Thank you so much. Well, is it working?
Yeah, my wife maybe. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor for me to be here, especially with this distinguished panel. Sara invited me kindly. Didn't know that when she invited me that I'll be in such great company, Professor Calvo and Professor Bhagwati, in addition, of course, to the distinguished scholars who are attending and participating, and all of you here. I'm not going to be giving a lecture. I'm just trying to share some of the recent developments in the G20 and what it is trying to do, especially in such global economic environment that we are facing. It's still the beginning of the year, and by the beginning of the year, you are getting all of these interesting reports coming from different organizations, sharing their ideas, projections, estimates about the world economic affairs. And I'm just picking some of the new reports and the suggestions coming from the researchers in different organizations, including the World Bank Global Economic Prospects. It's talking about the world economy has entered a very difficult phase, and it continues. And then if you need to see something different, it's not going to be very different. As such, the World Economic Outlook coming from the IMF just yesterday, that came from the bank last week. This is the update on the World Economic Outlook from the IMF, talking about the global recovery stalls, downside risks intensify, and is threatened by different strains, especially from the euro area. You need to change that a bit, get something else. Could be the UN telling you something different. It doesn't. World economic situation and prospects coming from the United Nations. It's saying here in the first paragraph that the world economy is on the brink of another major downturn. The only thing that is different a bit is coming from the UNCTAD on the Global Investment Trends Monitor. But as you know, the UNCTAD is focusing only on the foreign direct investment, is giving us the increase of FDI by 17% in 2011. But it continues when it is trying to share estimates about 2012. It says, well, it might grow, but it's going to be influenced by the global environment. Different from that is basically in terms of audience. As you know, the annual meetings of the leaders in business, government, and civil society organizations are meeting in Davos this week or this weekend. And here, the Global Economic Outlook, the agenda is talking about the public debt crises, fragile economic outlook, instability of financial markets, and the rollback of globalization. So there is some sort, I'll pick that at the end, don't worry. So I'll take care of this. As mentioned by Sara, I used to be in university for a while, so I'm enjoying some sort of freedom of action, not necessarily the way that a conventional world banker should be speaking at. So here, well, what the G20 then is going to be doing about all of that? It's good that you are familiar with the G20, so I shouldn't be spending too much time on that. But I have to share some of the things related to the G20 and the expectations of the public from the G20. I was in Egypt when a great professor on international affairs was sharing ideas at the American University in Cairo about the world order, new and old new orders, Professor Chomsky. And he was talking about, well, there is something there about building up new governance of the world. That is, at the time he was speaking, he was talking about the GATT. This was, of course, before the WTO. He was talking about the G7, and the G8 was not still in creation when he was talking about that. In addition to the IMF and the World Bank as basically responsible for the new government, responsible for economic issues. And now we still have this kind of argument. If the G20, as some people are saying, is it the de facto government of the world, or is it the de facto governance, global governance institution, or is it just a forum for discussion, or is it something close to a steering committee? I've been attending the G20 for almost 3 years now in different capacity, and when I joined the bank, a part of my responsibility is to be a deputy for the World Bank. So I attend the meetings, and I participate in the working groups and the seminars. It depends really on the items that you are discussing. I'll be sharing with you the agenda. In some of the areas, you can really feel that the G20 is working as a kind of a steering committee, getting ideas, sharing them, trying to have an influence on them, convince governments to cooperate and to coordinate matters, and then trying to, as mentioned by Uri Dadush and others, trying to get the institutions, international organizations or regional organizations, and in some cases as well, regional organizations to cooperate and collaborate nicely. And we have seen some sort of as mentioned by Robert Zoellick in one of his articles in the Financial Times, about, well, it is not just about the talk in the forum, but there is some action as well. If you check what happened in the London summit, for instance, there was some action, like the mobilization of funding for bailing out financial institutions. What happened in Korea, the raising funds for the IMF. Of course, the execution should be coming from many governments and many countries around the world, not limited to the members of the G20, but at least the start of the discussion and the collaboration is very much there. So I wouldn't really call it a kind of a de facto government, as some people say. And normally, those who are saying that are not really very much fond of the G20 as an informal grouping. They say, well, if the de facto government working under a particular agenda, and they start attacking it, that it is not really a legitimate government, doesn't have the rules, doesn't have the parliament, it doesn't have the rights of government and all of that. But it's not a government, and it doesn't really work as such. And at best, it could be an informal steering committee that shares views and try to push them into action. It has a comparative advantage, flexibility. It has the power of all of these people around it, with 85% of the world economy. We're talking here about membership that gets 9 of the advanced economies and 10 of the emerging markets economies, in addition to the European Union. And they bring to the table, by invitation, countries like Spain, which is a permanent invited guest now, in addition to some members from around the world, from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. So you cannot really consider that as an informal gathering for chat. And when it has all of the advisors to ministers, and then the deputies to ministers, and then the ministers and central bank governors, and then the presidents and the leaders in their meeting, you cannot really just say it does nothing, or it's trying to do something there. Here is the membership. I won't spend much time on that. I'm going to be leaving behind a document that we submitted to the board of the World Bank that has all of the details. Here I'm just saying that in addition to the members, the 19 plus the European Union. Each time, each presidency invites some people. As it happened in France, they invited Ethiopia, Singapore, Spain, the United Arab Emirates, and Equatorial Guinea to represent the African Union. Mexico, this is the turn of Mexico of leading the G20. They invited Colombia, Cambodia, Chile, Equatorial Guinea, again at the chair of the African Union, and Spain. So what happened then? In the past, since the 1970s, you had these gatherings of the G6. G6, this was before Canada joining. And then we had the G7 with Canada, and then the G8 with Russia included. And then, well, the G8 is still alive and well, and they meet and they have an important gathering of leaders in Chicago this year. But the G20 is being considered, even by the G8, as the prime place to discuss global economic issues. You cannot really discuss matters now in the absence of countries like China or India or Brazil or Russia, but Russia is in the G20 and others as well, of the emerging markets. So it's very much a multipolar world that you have this growing share of the emerging markets. Growing share as share in the world GDP. You can see the growing trend of the shares here, either at market exchange rate or at the purchasing power parity. Or if you compare the position today in 2010, 2011 figures to 1980, you see this kind of steady growth of share in the world economy by the developing countries. If you check the contribution of the developing countries to the world GDP growth, it's you can see there their significant contribution. The high income countries are in the blue, and then you can see more than 50% of growth in the 5-year period from 2006 to 2010 is coming from developing countries. If you check the figures on trade, again, the share of developing countries is growing significantly, and their share in the exports of the high-income countries as well is growing. So it's not just an issue of being happy to discuss matters with more countries or to be more inclusive or to be more democratic. It's a fact of life that you cannot really take decisions, and you take these decisions and assume that they are going to be effective and with an impact, and you ignore the presence, the strong presence of emerging markets and developing countries in the global economy today. The other thing is basically related to the very origins of the Gs, especially of the G20. Less famous G than the G20 was the G22 that had meetings back in 1998. It's called the G22 or the Willard Group. And the Willard is the name of the hotel that they met in a couple of times during the spring meetings and the annual meetings. And it was basically the G8 countries plus some developing countries. They didn't really live for long. And then we had the G33, had the G8 with some emerging markets and developing countries around the world. They found that the G20 could be much more better in terms of coordination, and they represent different continents, and if there are some gaps of representation, as I mentioned, they invite others. Right, so how is this G20's function? It doesn't have a permanent secretariat. And if you check some of the recent publications coming from the Koreans, who are taking this matter very seriously, as they do in life in general, they are really thinking, well, if for this G20 to be effective, it needs to have some sort of an institutional structure. It has to have governance. It has to have permanent secretariat. But for some different reasons, the leaders and the members of the G20 opted for no permanent secretariat, and they are relying on the presidency to do the job of the secretariat. So from London to Korea to France and then to Mexico, the presidency takes care of the secretariat functions. And it's very much informal, very much consensus-based, which makes things difficult to reach. And if you happen to be in any of the discussions of the communique, that normally starts at 7 or 8 p.m. and ends in the morning. So 11, 12 hours to finish this communique that is no more than 1 or 2 pages, but they take ages to reach agreements on the wording, and you would really assume why that's happening, different views, different backgrounds. But one of the positive externalities, I'm seeing a great deal of convergence of ideas, and at least people are referring to the same kind of material when they are taking decisions. Then, what are the highlights of the main issues of concern? When the meeting of the leaders happened in Washington in 2008, the main issue of concern, of course, was the stabilization of the financial markets and the bailing out of financial institutions, and they said something about restoring growth. London 2009 was basically about the implementation of the Washington Action Plan. Pittsburgh follow up on this, and they were more optimistic, talking about post-crisis world. Toronto talking about the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. And then Seoul Summit get us into the 9 pillars, the detailed 9 pillars of work. And the Cannes Summit had a long expanded list, but it was overtaken toward its end by the euro crisis. The Korean presidency in 2010, the 9 pillars were basically about ensuring global economic recovery, continuation of the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced global growth, talking about the international financial institution reform and the new global financial architecture, specific financial sector reforms in specific countries, especially the advanced economies, fighting protectionism and promoting trade and investment, and trying to monitor if there is any kind of new protectionist measures being undertaken or any kind of restriction facing investment by any kind of action, especially with the pressures coming from the political side in many countries that could be pushing for some protectionism of trade and investment. There was a financial inclusion item, and energy, given that fuel had its own crisis back in 2007, 2008, it was brought into the agenda. In addition to the fuel crisis and dealing with it with some sort of measures under the energy working group, we added to that commodities, including food. And then we had the development consensus on shared growth added to it. The French presidency, well, it's an issue of adding to the stock of the agenda, but each presidency wants to say something more. I would say here that the French presidency tried to do something about the reforms of the international monetary system, but as I said, it was more on the continuation of the Seoul Summit, and the Euro crisis has basically overtaken the discussion toward the end. But they managed to do well in matters related to food security. The infrastructure financing had some sort of attention. We're waiting for more action here than the attention. And there was an issue related to the climate change finance that was useful, and anti-corruption measures have been considered as well within this presidency. And here you see in the Cannes Action Plan for Growth and Jobs, there was some sort of agreement, and I know that in the invitation there was something about jobs here, so I'll try to share how from a global perspective, you can really tackle jobs. Can you really go and do some sort of ideas related to employment policies or fighting unemployment? Or is it really through what you can really consider by fighting the financial crisis, trying to put measures to prevent a repetition of a crisis or dealing with the outcomes of all crises by regulations, and you make some measures through which you can really maintain growth in the countries that are still growing and boost growth in the countries that are facing trouble in that. But in the French presidency, we started to see an invitation to the ministers responsible for labor. In the French presidency, we started to see more consideration given to the issue of jobs, but they were relying more on the, as they put it, on the Mexican presidency to take care of this item in terms of the implementation. There were some commitments, and each of the countries there, like the United States, for instance, said, we will implement reforms, including tax reforms, but for jobs and investment. Japan said, well, we'll quickly implement reconstruction measures, and this is going to be having an impact on jobs. Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, Germany, Korea, these countries were doing fine in relative terms, and Indonesia said, well, we are going to be doing more in what we are doing in terms of reforms and continuation in the discipline that we're introducing to public finance, but we are conscientious to the issue of job creation. So this issue of jobs is becoming there. But, well, the issue of jobs is a big thing. A recent book that came out a few weeks ago by Jim Clifton, the chairman and CEO of Gallup, under the title of the Coming Jobs War. He said, well, of all of what they are doing in world polling, that they see during the last 75 years what would fix the world, what would suddenly create worldwide peace, global well-being, and the next extraordinary advancements in human development. He would say that the immediate appearance of 1.8 billion jobs, formal jobs. That's what he's saying. There is some sort of disagreement about the figure, and from where you can really reach that exact figure, and how can you immediately create almost 2 billion jobs. And he says here formal jobs. Everybody's focusing on jobs, and there are many reasons to consider that: the unemployment, the social impact, the political impact. But here, it's not a propaganda, but basically a kind of an advance notice that the World Bank is working as well on this topic, and the flagship report of the bank, the World Development Report 2013, is going to be focusing on this issue. Okay, and we're talking about good jobs. This is the title of the WDR. It's going to be having some interesting debate. First, in academic environment, we're going to be questioning what good jobs mean, and the debate about is it good jobs or decent jobs that you're talking about. But here the definition is basically that good jobs in practice mean those jobs that are going to be enhancing living standards, contributing to productivity, and contributing positively to social cohesion. The ILO has its own definition of decent jobs. Then you get it from there. Well, is it a global perspective of jobs, or there are issues in different regions? Sub-Saharan Africa and what's doing about jobs, South Asia, creating enough productive jobs. Middle East, of course, and Middle East had signaled its real concerns about jobs recently in different ways, and the issue of mismatch, having many educated people but not necessarily skilled. So if you start dealing with this issue from the global perspective, you need to complement it with the regional perspective, and then at the end of the day, it's very much a country issue. What is the G20 is doing about that? Well, by claiming that if you are pushing for more sustainable, balanced shared growth, if you are going to be preventing protectionist measures, if you are going to be sustaining the development of the financial sector and get it more linked to the real economy kind of activities, you are going to be creating jobs. In addition to making some sort of specific items related to standards and the like, to and emphasis on skills and inclusion on jobs. I'm not quite sure that this is very much visible, but this is giving you the map of activities that under which the Mexican presidency is assuming that's going to be delivering the priorities that I just outlined through a finance track. This is basically the job of the ministers of finance and central bank governors, and there is a Sherpa track. The Sherpas report to the presidents, and they have their own responsibilities, and then all of these responsibilities go and converge toward the end and complement that with the work coming from B20, which is the business group attached to the G20, Think 20, the thinkers and the academicians, and the Young 20, or Y20, NGOs. So there are many 20s there at the end. All of that should really be there, available to the leaders to guide the world informally, as I mentioned at the beginning, because it's not a government, but basically through nudging and convincing each other of the merits of cooperation, coordination, and getting things done. I'm having a couple of minutes there, so what the World Bank is doing there. The World Bank is the G187. It's not a G20. We have 187 members. It's a government-based institution. It's not an informal gathering. We have our treaty, our agreements. What we are trying to do is basically to work as the bridge between the G20 and the non-member countries. The IMF would claim to be doing something similar in their own perspective. In our work, we don't really go beyond our mandate. We have the contribution to the mutual assessment process. We have our work on food security, which was one of the main deliverables of the G20, and we managed to do well in that, especially in matters related to the humanitarian reserve placement and the prevention of any kind of obstacles facing the flow of trade of food for any reason. And we have as well the risk management products. We work as well on the financial inclusion agenda. We'd be quite happy to answer any question on these items. We work as well on the financial regulations. We work with the IMF to monitor the soundness of financial systems of developing countries. The IMF has bigger mandate. They involve themselves as well with Part 1 countries or the advanced economies. We work on the climate finance. We work on some new initiatives like local currency, long-term finance, and we are trying to push more investments in infrastructure. And these are our deliverables and our contribution to the G20, in addition, of course, to the other assignment that we might get. The Mexican presidency is asking the bank to work more in all of these issues and with more emphasis on financial inclusion and disaster risk management. Here then, well, I started by giving you this view of what you know of the global developments. And this is why, how the G20 is trying to tackle them. And then I'll be quite happy then to listen to your views. And given my participation, I'd like really to take some messages with me. And the messages that I like to take, how the World Bank could be doing more within the G20 and beyond the G20 to deal, what are you expecting from it? And the other, what could be the message to the G20 in order to make it more effective and to help deal with the matters that are being outlined to them according to this agenda. And thank you so much for being patient and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud, very much. We're going to continue with the other speakers, and then we're going to open to questions, and then giving them the opportunity to get back to you. Our next speaker is Jagdish Bhagwati, University Professor at Columbia, Senior Fellow of International Economics and the Council of Foreign Relations. I'm tempted to say, you know Jagdish, but just to be fair for this panel, I'm going to go through it. He has been an economic policy advisor to the WTO, UN, and the GATT. He has served an expert group appointed by the Director General of the WTO on the future of the WTO, served the advisory committee of Secretary General Kofi Annan in the NEPAD process in Africa, etc., etc., etc. So he has lots of experience on these institutions, let alone on trade. He has published many academics, more than 300 articles and non-academic articles, writing in the Financial Times, New York Times this day. He has a well-authored and edited over 50 volumes, and he has been uniquely celebrated with several festivals in his honor and received several prizes and honorary degrees. So it's a pleasure to have him here. Jagdish.
Thank you, Sara. Let me congratulate you on a, can I take this one? Let me congratulate you on a very interesting account of the World Bank's role in G20 and so on. I'm myself actually not a G20 or G whatever. I'm a G1, just one. And my daughter, who was in the Marine Corps, she once told me that, Daddy, you're a great leader, but you have no followers. So I would just like to say that I'm really in the Keynesian tradition. Though Keynes was, of course, an insider as well. But basically, he wrote for the public, for public opinion. So I think one of the views that I have, which I might share with you, is that I think you best serve the public good by becoming a public nuisance, and you can't be that if you're working for governments. So there is a role for people like G1s, to be able to sort of sit outside of the framework. I mean, I think it's very important development in the system that there's so many of these institutional changes that are going on, like G20, the IMF and World Bank annual meetings. The WTO has been downplayed now and downgraded. I want to come back to that because the role of very big countries like United States is extremely important. I mean, we're really not in a multipolar world in the sense in which we might think it was. So there's still one big Rottweiler on the block, and that is the United States. And that matters a lot because the other powers bend to what, in fact, is the leading power in the world. And therefore, I want to mention that a little bit. But there's so many institutions, so many groups, as Andres Velasco knows, you've been on some too, they're continuously coming up, and I've been part of several also, by governments and non-governments and so on, so that you really have a whole, it's like a tropical jungle in a way. There's lots of trees growing up and reaching out for the sun. And, and it's, I guess it's good. I don't know. I mean, you've got a variety of things, but there's also excessive information which is going on. But it's here to stay. And there's no point complaining or anything. You just observe it and then try and operate within it, right? I mean, and I think so. G20 itself, if you go and look back at it, I think you correctly pointed out, and I think Sara did, as to how it grew. But I think it has a certain personality, which is that, like, when I'm a trade expert, as you know, and trade is just like a sideshow at the G20 meetings. Why? Because it came out of the finance ministers' meetings. So finance has always been the key thing out there, in my opinion. And I'm happy to see once in every now and then there's one paragraph, sometimes two, on how protectionism should be avoided, and also about how we should go and complete Doha, though even that has now been removed thanks to President Obama, who refused to even mention the word Doha. And I said in Davos last year that he obviously believed that Doha was a four-letter word, and political, civilized political discourse meant that you cannot pronounce that word. But the point is he killed Doha, absolutely, and none of the other countries had any guts to be able to say, look, you're just wrong, and point a finger. It's not that people have not pointed fingers, but how do you point a finger at the biggest country in the world, from whom also you need bakshish from time to time, right? Including appointments to important positions. So, I mean, we have to be realistic, okay, about this. But so G20 is not going to be a big player in trade. Let's grant that. It's reverted back to its earlier role. Now you take another very big issue that has come up, and that is a UN issue, right? Climate change. Again, the United States is not in a position to play. Under Obama, it has had to retreat into the George W. Bush of letting each country do its own thing. We kind of pretend that at Cancun, where the last meeting was held, or was it Durban? No, at Durban, that something was salvaged, but nothing was. I mean, if you really are honest, nothing came out of it. Because the two issues that were really important, one was when you accept an obligation, right? Like, I mean, in other bodies, particularly at WTO, if you say, this is an obligation to reduce a trade barrier, then you have consequences, right? If you don't do that, then you have to go up before the dispute settlement. Not that people will necessarily take you there, because again, power does play a role, and people will probably be more prudent about taking on big powers, but on the whole, they do. And therefore, and then there is a penalty, right? Try and say that to the kinds of commitments which we talk about on climate change. Andres, you know, nobody's going to accept anything like a commitment. So many of my friends who are in the business, they say, well, I mean, you know, we'll accept any commitment because there's no consequence. I mean, the head of the CBI you know, was a former editor of the Financial Times. He said, we'll take whatever is, you know, before us. It makes us look good. And we're not going to have to deliver anyway, because there are no penalties. Nobody has ever had the courage to say we must have a penalty. There's no one who will accept that. I'm only irresponsible governments and irresponsible G1s who will suggest it. Now you take also the business of the $100 billion, is that the fund for, you know, climate change? Some of us have pointed out that this should really not be, this should be based on a tort principle. Because if you make it on an aid principle, it will just be substituted for other forms of aid. And if you put it into the World Bank, with due apology to you, that's basically an aid organization. So if you put it into the World Bank rather than some other self-standing body, it is bound to be substituted for other aid, and we're not adding anything to the pot. But if you say, look, this is a tort principle, like in the United States, we have a super fund principle under which we say that even if you had no idea that you were damaging the environment at that time, you still have the liability to clean up. And this is called in legal literature strict liability, meaning even if you didn't know, you still have to go and clean up. This is United States pollution pay principle, right? So some of us have suggested we should do that also for the past century of discharges by the United States and many other leading countries, and put it on a tort principle. Then you can't say, I'm going to deprive you of foreign aid just because, you know, because this is a tort liability. So if an errand, you know, when somebody earns a tort payment, you don't say, I'm going to deprive you of Social Security payment, right? That is on top of whatever you're owed. Our great icon, Vice President Al Gore, you know, whom we all swear by, he does not support this principle. And two, when we say that, you know, this money should, if it is used for, you know, creating new technology, at least part of it should be like the food aid principle. Remember, when the seeds were created by Norman Borlaug and so on. So this is public money being used. So maybe some of it should be used to create new technology, which is freely available to everyone, like the seeds were. You try and sell that to Vice President Gore, who is heavily invested himself in creating new technology. It will never fly. It will never fly. So there are all these problems which only G1s can really point to, because by the time they get to the UN committees and so on, that's all buried, right? It has to be, because if I've been on committees where you know, where there are 10 other people, there's no other way except to, I think one of my teachers, Professor Paul Street in that rock, he said the way economists achieve consensus is by sharpening debate, meaning if Andres Velasco differs from me, I try and find out why, because he's using a different model, he's using different parameters. So we sharpen our differences, then we understand why we are reaching different conclusions. But in politics, he said, we reach consensus by obfuscating differences, by papering them over. And one of the real dangers of being on committees is that you just have to play that game. You can't do anything else. And then you get nothing, really, in most cases. So I would simply say that there are these problems. Now, I'll just say one or two things just on the specifics, aside from the climate change, where I don't see what's going to happen, because the climate change, we really haven't achieved anything. And sometimes it is better to recognize failure than to paper over and say, no, we've really saved it. And this is a problem with the WTO right now, because Americans have killed it. There's no question about it. Now, the only question is, do we then rescue some tiny little thing and say, we have saved it? I personally don't think that makes much sense. I mean, it's gone. It's gone, and so we've got to deal with the consequences. But there are different points of view possible on this. But I think so there's one thing before us from outside as, not as when we function on the inside as members of committees and so on. Then we've got to play the same game as everybody else, because you can't go around writing dissenting notes. I mean, you'll never be re-invited anyway if you didn't do that. So it's not in your own interest either. But when you're outside, you're free to write. You're free to write, right? And so I think at least since we are in an academic environment, I would say to urge everyone here, when you go out into the public policy space, remember that you are really writing not for governments, but really for other people to form public opinion, whether civil society or otherwise. And even governments, actually, ministers, etc., do read what you write. It's not as if it's completely, for one another. So that's one thing. Now, I would just say on trade, why is it that the United States is really, and I think this is one thing which is really it's a good illustration of how lack of leadership can undermine a system. Because I think everybody would agree that WTO was a very important development. It had binding commitments, it had a dispute settlement mechanism which was working very well. And this is a thing where, and it also used to have multilateral trade liberalization. What happened, actually, for us, and it's a particularly surprising thing because President Obama, for whom I voted, of course, I, in fact, did two favors to him. Because first, when Hillary was clearly the winner, and since I never expect to be rewarded by any governments, because I'm too independent, like my student Paul Krugman, so I used to carry a little button for Obama, and everybody thought I was crazy because they were all rooting to get back into the administration, so they were not going to vote for Obama. Well, then suddenly the world changed, you see, and Obama became the big favorite. So I gave him, during the primary, you're allowed to give $2,300. And then after the primary, you're allowed to give another $2,300. And I'm incidentally an American national, so I wasn't violating any laws by giving money. Because if you're not a national, you should not be giving any money. So first I supported him. I wrote in the Financial Times for him. And then I was giving by dribblers. So I sent five contributions to him up to 2,300. So, and this is something which the students here should remember, how to evaluate data. So I've been counted as 5 small guys. Now, he was making a lot of the fact that small fellows were supporting him. Well, I de facto cheated. That wasn't my intention. And so remember to look at these beautiful charts and so on. Go a little deeper because they look wonderful when you see them. But once you start examining them, there are little dangers lurking in them. So anyway, I think President Obama, when I say that, he's let us down, I would just say that, to be fair to him, that he's had very difficult problems. First, on the fiscal side, faced with this enormous problem of creating the Keynesian stimulus, he was facing a huge fiscal constraint which was imposed on him by President George W. Bush, who did not he did not pay for the war, let me just put it that way. So that constrained President Obama. So this was a sin of commission. But on trade, he was facing from President Clinton a sin of omission. Why? And this is a paradoxical statement I'm making, because President Clinton fought like a tiger for NAFTA and for the Uruguay round. And the same man who was now returned to Chicago, Mayor Mr. Daley, he was his chief man. But the point is, you'll remember, President Clinton, once he found religion in trade after 1 year's hesitation, he basically fought the unions. He did not convert them, he vanquished them, right? And it was a very hard-fought war. And he never really got Paul Krugman, who was on my side at that time, before he started writing for the Times and found his religion, which is anti-republicanism. So he's never written a column criticizing any Democratic position, because he's very loyal to that side. But at that time, he was entirely on my side, and virtually most of the economists, whether Republican or Democrats, were. So the president, Clinton could have said, look, let's get hold of John Sweeney and let him bring any lieutenants that he has, who advise him, saying, trade is really hurting you, right? Hurting the workers. And let's have it out, right? Let's discuss, because that's what debate and dialogue is about, not diatribes, but debate. But he never did that. He just went for them. And then what happened for poor Obama is, in the last election, the unions came back with a vengeance in the Democratic Party. They were vanquished, but they were not converted, and now they were resurgent. So either they elected people, Democrats, who agreed with the union's point of view independently, like Sherrod, the guy from, I think he's from Ohio. Or there were people who were elected with union support, who therefore voted with the unions. So poor Obama, whatever his views on trade, God knows what they are, is suddenly faced with a situation where he doesn't have the time or energy or the inclination to be able to now convert the unions. So the unions have captured him. So therefore he's against trade, period. There's no question. And whom does he appoint as his advisors? Only people like Alan Kruger, who also believe in the same thing, that trade is bad for, he's a very smart economist, but I think he's wrong on this. But he's written extensive. So they go and pick and choose people who are going to tell them what they want to hear, essentially. That's the choice that's how you choose advisors when you become a president. Remember, select someone who's going to rubber stamp what you say and not create problems for you. So I think that is what has happened to President Obama. And I therefore think that he's just abandoned good sense on this and abandoned a sense of leadership. I think many people sort of think he's wrong or that he tends to compromise too much. That's not my position, because you have to compromise in order to get along. You know the famous witticism about him, which is anti-him, which I don't share, which is that he's the kind of guy who will make a compromise in the following way, that faced with a jihadist or a fundamentalist who wants to take you back to the 7th century, and Obama wants us to be in the 21st, and Obama will settle for the 14th. Now, I don't buy that. I mean, that's unfair to the president. The president, he's got to compromise once in a while, but I think he lacks the guts to take on and provide the leadership. This is what bothers me, that I don't think he's he's really not displayed that kind of statesmanship, because a statesman is distinguished from a politician not by ignoring public opinion. He's got to pay attention to it, but to reshape the specific demands which they have, so that you go and tell them, look, this is not, your concerns are okay, but this is not the way to handle them. We've got other ways of handling it. And I don't see too much on the president's part. So I would just add, this is just to illustrate how, and once the US decided to kill it, there was no one who could really stand up and do anything. So I think that point, so it's almost like, like a communist system where you've got to work from within. We have to write and say things because no governments are going to do it for you. None of them at all, in my judgment. And I've seen so many of them just bend under. And I don't blame them because they have to get along, right, in the world. And if this is a major power. So the only way to handle a major power is through G1s, in my opinion. Basically, try and create public opinion. I'm talking almost like Chomsky, whom I do admire, but whose views I don't share. Okay? But I think he's got something going, since you mentioned him, right? And finally, I would sometimes I wonder whether the president really is interested in cosmopolitanism. Like I'll just give you a couple of examples. I'll just leave it as a thought, because that does affect the way G20 and all the major institutions are going to work. And one, of course, is when he went to Cairo and gave that great speech on Islam, right? Remember? In your country. And one thing which struck me was that he was so ill-read, or his speechwriters, because instead of saying, look, we've had this Andalusian Spain, 500 years of toleration, right? Under Muslim rule. And he could have said, look, each civilization, each religion has toleration and intolerance, right? And therefore, you have to follow your own tradition, right, of tolerance, which is a shining one for 500 years. I mean, there's so many books, but I don't think he had read anything. And his speechwriters had not. And that would have carried much more weight to say, look, you should appeal to your own tradition, rather than say, implicitly appeal to ours. And ours is a country which is not exactly, our tradition also leaves a lot to be desired, right? The Holocaust and so forth. So many things. No religion is perfect, but each religion has two, or each ethnicity has two traditions. And he was ill-read, and I thought it was a big letdown, and I wrote about it at the time. And the second thing, which is, I'll just leave it as a funny thing, he just continuously mispronounces names. And since he uses a teleprompter and has idiots writing his speeches, they put in names which he doesn't know how to pronounce. So, when the Indian Prime Minister came here, he mispronounced in just 3 minutes. He mispronounced the Prime Minister's wife's name twice, and he called Prime Minister Nehru President Nehru once. And when he went to India, he mispronounced in the parliament, because I spoke 2 weeks after that in the same hall, and they said he was reading from a teleprompter. I should not do that. And I don't need a teleprompter. I just speak. Even if it's lousy, I just speak. And so they said, he had mispronounced names in the parliament also. And then I was telling the Japanese ambassador that, just saying, how we Democrats are let off, because if Bush had done even dropped one brick like that, we would be all over him, right? And here is about 7 times that he did that. So I was telling the Japanese ambassador, and the Japanese ambassador said, it's funny, because when he came to Japan, he was mispronouncing all the Japanese names. Now, it doesn't take much, even for an American, to learn how to pronounce a name properly, right? I mean, I know George W. Bush because I was misinvited to a Republican conference, because they just assumed if I was for free trade, I must be a Republican, which I'm not. And he actually pronounced the Prime Minister's name, which was Vajpayee at that time. When he came, and, I had to say something. He was coming straight at me, and he pronounced it correctly. He called India a subcontinent, which is unusual for an American politician. I'm sure they don't even know where India is located. And so it was strange, because the man had put some heart into it, obviously. And And then, of course, he winked at me. And he said, you know, I try and talk to your Prime Minister, Vajpayee, all the time about peace. And then he said, but most of the time I can't understand what the hell he's saying. So I was about to wink back because he's so disarming and say that I'm sure the Prime Minister says the same about you, Mr. President. But I just stopped in time. But it's not difficult. It's not difficult to take some pain. And I really wonder now, you know, I really wonder whether the President has any genuine international interest. It's something which worries me, because I'm talking like a CIA psychological profiler of foreign. I mean, if we turn the same thing on to President Obama, I wonder, you know, what is he up to? Like his latest initiative on Trans-Pacific Partnership, that is motivated by taking on China. It has nothing to do with cosmopolitanism. It's getting United States a role in Asia vis-a-vis China, which they're afraid of. That is not cosmopolitanism. That is sort of taking advantage of the fear in Asia over China's aggressive behavior and trying to move in to take advantage for United States. So that's not an altruistic hegemon. That's a selfish hegemon. That's not cosmopolitanism. That is self-interested action. Of course, we are all into self-interested action to some extent. But the United States, I think right now, is in danger. And if you read yesterday's speech and so on, you know, militating against outsourcing and then talking about manufacturing, fetish and so on. There's so many bad ideas in that. It just, I just read it. I didn't dare to listen to it yesterday because my wife, who is a very strong supporter of Obama, would have knifed me if I'd said the slightest thing. But I'm worried. Okay, sorry, I talked too long.
No. Thank you very much, Jagdish. Indeed, the speech last night that we watched was very non-international, so something to worry about. Our third speaker is Guillermo Calvo, Professor of Economics at SIPA, Director of the Program Economic Policy Management since 2007. He was a distinguished university professor at University of Maryland, Chief Economist of the Inter-American Development Bank, Senior Advisor at the Research Department at the IMF, and President of International Economic Association and the Latin American Economist Association. And also has ties with the University Torquato di Tella, where he held the Francisco Soldati Professor of Economics title. Also, he has written several articles, academic articles, non-academic articles, I would say, not several. A few.
Important ones.
And also enjoys several awards and acknowledgements. Guillermo.
Well, I have a presentation which I hope I can. But let me thank you, Sara, and, for the opportunity to join this group and to welcome Mahmoud, thanking him for a very comprehensive presentation. I thought that you will give us a whole picture, so I put myself in the shoes of what Jagdish calls a G1. So I said, well, let me challenge the G20 or the G20 organization and things that are being going on, but saying a couple of things that bother me. I must say I was rereading, it's true, I haven't written many policy papers, but this one in Vox, which I wrote after the 2009 meeting, and I realized that I was very optimistic because it was the time that the G20 put a lot of pressure on the IMF to create new instruments the flexible credit line, for example. And very soon, one of the recipients was Mexico. And I was very impressed because the last time that Mexico needed big help was in 1995 with the tequila crisis. And it took about 3 months for them to get that because they had to get many institutions organized. And this time it was given to Mexico immediately. So I said, wow, this is what I was hoping to see. And that's what happened. Not only that, but then the Fed continued with the currency swap and so on and so forth. And you know that those instruments have been extended to several other countries since. Now, with the benefits of hindsight, as they say, Mexico output in 1995 fell by 6%. And it also fell by 6% in 2009. So it's a beautiful idea, but Mexico got badly hit. So now, after a couple of years, I have the sense that the G20, they are very well intentioned. Actually, if I'm impressed by something, it's a list of things that you want to achieve in the world. And if you do really, we are going to be much better. But I think I have the impression that we are running out of ammunition for the big countries. And that is kind of reflected too in the effectiveness, or maybe affected too, in the effectiveness of the G20. So one thing I wanted to bring up, because I think the G20 doesn't emphasize that enough. Let me just say it in basically one word, is the importance of money and finance. That is the issue. I know that Jagdish would like to see other stuff being mentioned, but even that does not receive a strong enough emphasis. So I want to show you, that's why I have a presentation. I think central banks have been the big players in this. Central banks, I think, had a lot to do with causing the Lehman crisis. And if you look at this picture that I've been showing around the world so many times that for sure my students know it. But if you look at this picture, there you see for the emerging markets, this is the yield on public bonds. So you see the crisis started already, and nothing happened to the yield of public bonds in emerging markets until Lehman happened. So here is when everybody was talking about decoupling. But then Lehman happened, and Lehman is a result of the central banks all of a sudden drawing a line on the sand and saying, that's where we are going, and that's it. So first of all, you have the impression that obviously, we know that lots of things were not running well, but first of all, the absence of the central banks for a minute had a tremendous impact. Even Chile, and here we have the former minister who was in charge of the economy at the time, a very well-run economy. We see that despite the new instruments, which Chile did not benefit from because you chose not to, not because you had been excluded, this is the flow of credit, and this line is 2 standard deviation. So this shows that the credit just collapsed like a rock. And then it went back. But this is very impressive how something that's happening here in the north on a bank which was not that big after all, had an immediate impact. Now you say, oh, fine, so they caused the crisis. Well, and they also stopped the crisis. And you see something that we had not seen in the previous crisis, which is, this is a measure of the risk, in the banking sector in advanced economies, and you see that when Lehman happens, there's a big jump. And then, as you know, you must remember, the central banks came back in force. And they said, no, don't worry, and they bail out anybody who went by the Federal Reserve. And it went down in a matter of months or less. So here you see that the central banks in advanced economies played a big role. They're a very central player. And why is this relevant? Because now we are talking about the ECB, that with Trichet was a little bit reluctant, and now with Draghi seems to be changing a little bit, and we already see the effects. It's amazing how the short-term interest rates have gone down, not the 10-year interest rate, because poor Draghi had to deal with the political apparatus down there. But these are issues that I would like to be highlighted. I mean, we have the facts. So those that say the ECB has to get into the action, I tend to agree with that. Certainly it's very complicated, but that's where the G20 come in. So that's the first point that I would say. So this is not a criticism, it's simply saying this would be nice to highlight. Now, if the central banks run out of ammunition, then you have to start talking about debt forgiveness. Don't look for the IMF to help you. The IMF never, I mean, it's in their DNA. D is not for debt. It's no way. So debt forgiveness is not there. And as far as I can read in the latest communique of the G20, debt forgiveness is not there either. Now, in this country, we are speaking about debt forgiveness, and I think it's the right time. It's too late, even, for doing that. And one of the Obama statements yesterday goes in that direction. So if you cannot pay the debt, it's better to find some way to clear the books. I mean, we don't know that so well, those that have been looking at the emerging market. We know that it was the Brady program that finally unlocked the big debtors and stopped the lost decade in the 80s and early 90s. So that's a lesson that we have learned too, but nobody wants to speak about that. And I know it's very complicated, but maybe it should be put forward and say, sure, this is a hard issue, but that's what the G20 should be there for. To face hard issue, and then they say, well, and on that we cannot agree, fine, but don't look the other way. Now, so what do the G20 do? And I may be exaggerating here, Mahmoud, I hope you don't take it personally. The role of central banks, they don't say much about the role of central banks, as I said, the need for debt forgiveness. Instead, I found something that I always found in things coming from Washington or the G20, some of the Gs. Everybody all of a sudden is this mantra of flexible exchange rates, and which is badly defined. Nobody tells you exactly what it means. Now, let me say a few things that I know. My question is, what about the cap on the Swiss franc? It just happened. The Swiss put a cap. What about Japan's huge intervention in the currency markets in 2010? And they will. I wouldn't be surprised if they do it again. What about Brazil complaining about the currency wars? It's because he sees that this is happening around. And what about this, that few people realize because it's a very subtle operation, these large currency swaps that they don't even count as a loan because it's pure. I mean, it doesn't go anywhere, in no books, in no fiscal anywhere, because you give dollars and they give you euros. Now, why do they need euros if we have flexible exchange rates? And the amounts are not small. Now, when you talk to them, they say, well, yeah, because if you don't have that, then there's going to be a lot of volatility. So what about floating exchange rates? What do you mean by floating exchange rates? That you will let them float whenever you wish? That's not floating exchange rate. That's cheating. Sorry.
float.
I'm getting excited.
Which is unusual. Right?
So what do we know about the theory? And this is why I'm very worried about that. I'm not pro-con. Of course, I have a slight preference for fiscs. Coming from Argentina, we do that all the time. So flexible exchange rate, what do I know from the theory? Well, now interest rates are near zero for advanced countries, okay? So the stuff that circulates is like cash. They have different colors, that's all. Everybody talks about accumulation of international reserves. What does that mean? That now you have a demand holder which is very different from the one we teach our students. I was giving a class today on that when I said, well, I mean, you use that to buy bread or to do this. No, this is, you buy it, you hold it in the vaults of the bank, and you are a pure speculator. When you put a young guy in charge of managing international reserves, what does he do? He doesn't have a tremendous reference for one or the other currency. There are considerations that have to do with trade and so on. But if he hears that the Swiss franc is a good place to put your money, he will invest in the Swiss franc. So there is a huge speculative. We have created. We are in a world which we have to realize we live there. I'm not sure that people realize that we live in a world where the demand for dollars is in the hands of institutions that don't go to use the dollars to buy something in the corner store. This is speculative. And nothing wrong with being speculative, but it's a different demand for dollars that can switch instantly from dollar to yen. And when you look at the numbers, you realize that the yen, stock of yen, and that you can get those numbers from the IMF, is very small relative to the stock of euros and the stock of dollars in the vaults of the central banks. So any slight change in the composition increases the demand for yens like crazy. Now, what are the Japanese going to do? Intervene, of course, because we still have sticky prices. So we still live in a world of sticky prices. With huge changes, what would you expect the authorities will do? They will intervene. And then Minister Mantega from Brazil will say, oh, that's currency war. It so happens that it's not a war as such, it's that they are trying to prevent a major catastrophe because of a speculative change in the demand for currencies, something that in the old days you wouldn't see because each country had its own currency. So there was some inherent instability to that, to the currency. So I think that's where we live. So we have to be very careful. I think that that's an issue that the G20 should face. We live in a different world, and we have to understand. So so yes, my fear is that, of course, if you start intervening, you can get used to that, and protectionism is a thing. Now, that's what I was going to end with this, but then I realized that the issue of jobs was going to come up, and one of my co-authors, Pablo Tonello, sent me one slide on a paper that we are working on, and so let me say very briefly something about what we are finding. Here is this is the only one I'm going to show. The jobless recovery, that's what we are seeing now. I fully agree that jobs is an important issue, but now we are finding that something even more, quote unquote, interesting, if you wish, or challenging, and that is that you have a recovery. Look at the United States. This is output. The output is back where it was at the beginning of this, but unemployment is still high. Go to Europe, you do the same thing. They're a little bit behind. But compared to what happened to the unemployment rate, it's very different. So this is what's leading people to say that we are now in a world with a jobless recovery. Now, so we started to think, what can this explain? It's a paper that we are writing jointly with Pablo Tonello here in the room. He's a graduate student in the department, and Fabrizio Coricelli, who is a professor at the Paris School of Economics. And so this is work in progress. I mean, I'm not showing it here, but our conjecture is that, again, financial issues may have a lot to do with the jobless recovery. And so we have a sample, and it appears to support our conjecture. Now, why would that be? Our conjecture is that it's much more difficult. When you have had a crisis like this, there's a big destruction of collateral. So, as you know, when collateral goes down, it's more difficult to lend. Now, something that I haven't seen mentioned in the literature is that not all investments require the same amount of collateral. Think about buying a computer. The computer is the collateral of your investment right there. Compare that with hiring 100 people and having to do search for hiring 100 people. There's no collateral there. And if that doesn't work out, you cannot send the workers back to the bank. You can send the computer, but not the workers, of course. And so all of a sudden, there is a comparative advantage, an interesting comparative advantage there in terms of credit, where it may be easier to get credit for capital-intensive activities than for labor-intensive activities. So that's another angle. I mean, in a few weeks, we are going to have the results to show. But, so far, what we are getting is very hopeful. But that's another angle. That's why I would insist, and I end with this, that there is room for paying much more attention to financial issues. We are coming from a financial crisis. I don't think we are putting enough emphasis on the fact that we are coming from that corner. And maybe there are things that we can do if we just really focus on that and work on that corner. And of course, much more would have to be done. But maybe we can make a difference. And why am I so hopeful? Because I started my presentation by showing you how quickly the central banks, by going back, were able to lower the risk in the banking sector after the Lehman episode. So there are certain things. The financial sector is very tricky and creates things which are horrible overnight. But the other side is that maybe the solutions are also tricky, if you wish, easy to get, if you know where to hit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. No, it's not any longer there, but I was going to ask a question related to that graph, which is that whether you can relate that to what we learned from the Latin American crisis, what you and your co-author have named the Phoenix miracle, or it's something that it's very preliminary and you still cannot say anything about it.
Well, no, I wouldn't want to monopolize. No, let me say that, no, we...
What is a Phoenix miracle? Sorry,
A Phoenix miracle is something that we found some years ago, in which the emerging markets come out of the crisis is provoked by a credit crunch, but they come out of the crisis without credit. And as an issue that Argentina, the IMF thought that Argentina was not going to be able to recover because they were out of the market. They did. So we found that Argentina was not the exception, was the rule. So no, but the answer, Sara, we haven't done that work as yet.
Okay, so I think we got a good menu of issues here, and I see that what Mahmoud said, that for the World Bank, there's not much beyond the mandate of the World Bank. And I think it's clear. The only thing that made me think, and having been at the World Bank for 20 years, is the nervousness that this laundry list creates on us. You know, at the bank for many, many years, we have been discussing, well, maybe we should narrow, you know, the topics that we discuss at the bank. So we have a lot of experience on focusing on many things at the same time. I think what Jagdish said related to trade, that trade is a sideshow, it might be a good issue in this context, given the urgency that the Europe crisis is creating. So climate change and trade, maybe it's not the time to be discussing and to focus on these issues of the exchange rate issues, given that protectionism, it's increasing. So that's one issue. The question that I think Jagdish raised is, if there is a lack of international interest from the US, where will the leadership come in relation to this crisis? Because the US has had the leadership, or still has dominance on trade, still has dominance on climate change, but now suddenly there's no dominance from the US. So that's one thing that I wanted to ask. Okay, let's open for questions, and
Thank you.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, take that. The lady first, and then the gentleman.
Hello, hi. My question is, thank you so much for a very interesting talk. My name is Haya, and my question is to Mr. Mahmoud. So I would like to ask you, do you in terms of like all the changing agendas right now with the financial crisis and everything that's happening, how are the poor and low-income countries being affected? So for example, this new, this SDR new allocation for the IMF, are the developing countries going to benefit from that? And how is that changing the priorities? And in terms of like current priorities for the World Bank and IMF, if you can tell us a bit more about that.
Let's collect a few questions, and then.
Good idea.
Good evening. Simple question, probably not a simple answer. Given the problems we have in the United States and Europe in particular, should the Western economies be pursuing economic policies around austerity or stimulus? And follow-up question, given the problems in Europe, will Greece survive in the Eurozone 2012?
Let's take two more, and then we'll. Yeah.
Professor Bhagwati, as you mentioned, President Obama refuses to support the Doha round. Instead, the US and most G20 countries have been promoting trade by signing bilateral free trade agreements, which are often confused with free trade. So my question is, what is the risk for the world economy of promoting trade through bilateralism instead of multilateral trade liberalization?
There was one in the back first.
Professor Calvo, you talk about the role of central banks in dealing with financial crises. Do you think that the ECB should take a hit on Greek bonds? Thank you.
Okay, let's stop here and yeah. Mahmoud, go ahead.
Right. Thank you so much. And let me start very quickly with the valuable comments of Professor Bhagwati and Professor Calvo, and then try to respond to a couple of the interventions. On the issue of trade, I cannot take any of the comments in a kind of a personal way, because I don't belong to the G20. The World Bank is an invited guest to the G20. I belong to the G187. And that's not safe of trouble, but I'll be quite happy to respond to any question related to the bank. But the issue of trade comes in different forms. If you check the Mexican leadership now is considering the multilateral trade to be under the Sherpa and to be considered at the summit. So this is coming in the discussion. But it's coming as well through the trade finance and the concern about the restrictions and the perceived restrictions either by excessive regulations, and now there is a debate about this, and we have been working closely with the World Trade Organization to make sure that none of the regulations are going to be harming trade finance, especially if they are not intending to harm them. And we managed to do well with that, and there is some good work in between the bank, the WTO, and the Basel Committee on this. The other related matter is basically the deleveraging and the understanding of the extent of deleveraging. And I think there's going to be a very big topic this year, especially the impact on Eastern European countries, some of the African countries that are going to be affected unless the deleveraging is going to be done in an orderly manner and without really getting into a kind of a fire sale. Here this is not the issue of just selling the asset at cheap price, but what kind of an asset, if it is related to a banking activity, is going to be affecting trade and development finance. The other thing is basically coming through the whole talk about imbalances and the growth. So trade is there, and when the WTO attend the meetings with the ministerial, with the support of Pascal Lamy and the president of the World Bank as well, with his enthusiasm in this area of trade, Robert Zoellick, they get some attention. But this is not a trade forum. You are very much right about that, because at the end of the day, each entity would be having a kind of a function and an objective for it that's going to be judged against at the end. The G20 is mainly about dealing with the crisis, the financial crisis, and the prevention of another one. There's going to be basically the main thing. Well, they have the rest of the items on the laundry list mentioned by Sara. They are there, but basically the issue of financial crisis, there is a debate as well as Professor Calvo about are they doing the right thing, are they dealing with matter. Professor Calvo is very clever, returning to his point. Well, he's reading between the lines to get this issue of the flexible exchange rate. Now, this is not really one of the main thing that there is a kind of an agreement that I got from the communique. There is some sort of an implicit assumption that you are right about, but there isn't really any kind of explicit recommendation of an adoption of a particular matter. The other point that you raised is very interesting, and I do not really see agreement. I'm not the spokesman of the G20, but let me tell you that there is an interesting debate now about this issue of jobless recovery, jobless growth. There could be some sort of employment gains on the short term without realized sustainable growth at the same time. So this issue of the classic association between growth and employment, the assumption of having an Ocon law in operation is being very much challenged. The issue of resources, what I mentioned now, related, well, what's going to be the impact on low-income countries and the poor? The representatives of developing countries and emerging markets, they are not advanced economies, and they have a fair share of number of poor. The middle-income countries, including countries like India, China, still has its own poor. So this issue of the impact on the poor, not just on the low-income country, but poor and poverty in general, is very much there. And this is one of the main contribution of having the 10 countries from the emerging markets, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, all of these countries do have issues related to poverty and inequality at the same time, and they are very much careful about that. So when the discussion that is taking place now, as it used to be as well, there are some similar discussions regarding the resources of the IMF, the issue, well, what's going to be the impact on the poor? The IMF is basically serving a global public good, not just Europe. These kind of discussions are fair to be there and to be shared. So they are very much there in the consideration. However, whatever is needed for dealing with matters related to poverty, poor in developing countries, including low-income and middle-income countries, and there are many poor as well in the advanced economies, being tackled then by other policies. Some of them are being tackled, like the matters related to social safety nets, social inclusion, the inclusive growth, the green growth as well, which is being considered now with this kind of consideration for growth to be inclusive within a green growth environment.
Okay.
I think the
there
questions.
was a question on austerity measures vis-a-vis stimulus measure. Someone would like to take it?
I'll be happy to. There was a
You should do
question.
that.
Okay.
Then I'll
Okay.
deal with the other stuff later.
Okay. Now on austerity measures, I think we have to be very careful with that issue. It's becoming a focal point. Obviously, everybody knows that. So there are the for's and the against, and both have they make good points, but it seems to me that they are incomplete. They talk about issues that have nothing to do with the crisis. Therefore, they say there is not enough demand, so let's increase demand. Okay, so it sounds like, I mean, it's not idiotic, at least. The others say, if you increase demand, you will increase the fiscal deficit, and that will increase the debt, and that will cause interference with the private sector, and that's another good point. Who is talking about the financial issue? I mean, I had an accident in Wall Street or somewhere there. Why don't I go and try to fix what's missing there? Why small and medium enterprises in these countries cannot borrow? Why households are borrowing? Because they are over-indebted. Why don't we talk about that? That's why I brought that up. Oh yes, we can make a difference by increasing aggregate demand. I'm very worried, and I tell you why. Because I look at the so-called unfunded liability. Everybody talks about debt. These are registered debt. If you look at unfunded liability, and the United States is 80-something%, right? In Italy, it's over 100%, and we say, oh, that's very, very large. Well, go look at unfunded liabilities. They are 400% of GDP in this country, in Europe. And so one reading of this, some people say this is a crisis of capitalism. No, I think this is a crisis of the welfare state. You know what is the share of France's expenditure in GDP now? 57%. Is that a capitalist economy? So it makes, I'm not going one way or the other, but I cannot take it lightly, increase government expenditure and get out of this, because I know, besides, how difficult it is to roll back those expenditures. I mean, there's plenty of experience with that. So I think if I put my finger into this, if I was dealing with this, I mean, as was a policymaker, the first issue is financial issues. I think what they are doing in Europe about trying to get the ECB to be more proactive is a good idea. That's a financial solution. And they have to be careful. There was a question about the ECB should be hit if the Greeks don't pay. I think that could make the ECB ineffective, because when you give, if the ECB is going to be the first one to get the money back, which is the situation with the fund, when the fund gives you a loan, you are crowding out the rest of the creditors. So it's not additional funding, it's additional pushing. and that doesn't help the country to get more funding. So if you do that with the ECB, then the ECB would not be effective either. So leaving aside other considerations, that I think that's fundamental. The other one is that you don't want the ECB to be also a fiscal authority. So they want to be independent. So in order to be independent, if they start doing things which are fiscal, then forget about the independence of the ECB. So that would be that's basically my answer. Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Interesting.
The other question was about the liberalism vis-a-vis multilateralism, right? For Jagdish.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me address that, but then let me first address the issue which Sara raised, which is that given this huge crisis, we should really forget about climate change. You'd be lynched by climate change people for saying that, because for them that's the overriding crisis. This is only a short-run thing. And also trade. But the point is, this is the answer I get from my friend Martin Wolf, who in the last 3 years has written about nothing except the crisis. Probably 300, 400 articles, and add to it the A-list people, and God knows, I mean, there are probably 1,000 things written in the Financial Times. Nothing on trade, very little on climate change. It's a stupid policy, actually, on the part of the FT, because FT has virtually killed Doha, in my opinion, because by saying that nothing matters except the crisis. And can there be 4,000 articles on the crisis? I mean, it's nonsense, actually. I mean, it's the same wretched stuff being recycled all the time by these guys who claim to be pundits on the subject. And as Guillermo has pointed out, they don't even get to first base on analyzing the thing properly, right? So what's happening to so one important question is, why is the media so important? I mean, it's a broader question. And they just talk to, they virtually laid down. And it is just a few people. And you see that, and this is really for Nick Lehman at the, who is our dean, very distinguished at the journalism school, where I also lecture sometimes. And that is, I don't know if you watch TV and read magazines and so on, the same guys, like David Brooks is writing for the New York Times, then he's on the other one, Farid Zakaria, on the McNeil Lehrer and so on. In the old days, people like Guillermo, myself, and many others got a chance to be on the TV. Not anymore. They're just stroking each other. There's a de facto combined now, cartelization. And so what I call the G1, the ability of G1 to put its oar into the water is steadily diminished, in my judgment. So I think this is again raising this broader issue as to why people feel that, somehow the crisis is all that you need to worry about as defined by them, and that any other thing is of no count. I mean, climate change I don't have to argue, because I agree with people who think it is an overriding issue, and it's really a pity. I know there's a diversity of opinion, but I think, basically, vast majority of scientists do believe it's a major issue. And, time is important. And it's a pity we were not able to get our act together. But even trade, is it not? How can you say trade is not important? It's ridiculous, because, the president and the U.S. is, in fact, you take the reaction on Buy America. The president initially fought it, remember? Now, in the latest sort of, as doubtless you people in Washington know, he's actually supporting people who want to do Buy America. He's supporting actions to support manufacturers. And how is it going to happen? Except through protectionism, through subsidization. And, I could document it. So are we really that sure that this kind of policy isn't going to undermine open markets, which, in fact, there are so many studies, including some from the distinguished ones from the bank, which show that this is really the wrong way to go. So, but who will, I mean, some of us write about it, but it's not part of the kind of debate the way it used to be some years ago. Let me just say that there is this sharp deterioration in the quality of the public debate, because I think things have changed in the system. And now I'll come to just why should we worry about the WTO, about the Doha die? So let me just give very quickly how I think about it. The WTO has sort of three elements from this perspective. One is it was the institution under which you had multilateral, non-discriminatory trade liberalization. So by and large, there's always some discrimination will come in. So that is, once Doha is gone, that's gone, all right? So we're going to be left only with free trade agreements, plurilateral, and so on. But these are all discriminatory agreements of one kind or another. So that is going to be the way we proceed. Then there are two other things. One is rule-making, because the WTO is also where you make rules about anti-dumping, subsidies, etc., etc. So that rule-making then will also be compromised, because once the bilaterals take over, and particularly with big countries like United States, and EU also plays the same game often, these are what the French would call hyperpowers, right? And we call superpowers, or just great powers, or hegemonic powers. They basically will tell little guys, like Singapore, now Andres is gone, I can say Chile as well, but these are relatively small powers, okay? So they just basically take it, right? And I've had some of our students have been in Chile, for instance, negotiating, and they tell me, Professor, what can we do? We are just forced. We just have to sign on the dot if we want a free trade agreement. This is just unequal power. And this is what you see happening. So all kinds of rules come in, I don't want to bore you with, which are really harmful to trade because our lobbies are pushing for them. Good lobbies, bad lobbies, indifferent lobbies, but it's a game of lobbying. And this is what worries me, that the role of G1s is completely gone. You can be quite sure of that. It is really, and sometimes I testify in Congress, and the congressman will say, this is just your point of view. We are not interested. No lobby has ever told us to worry about such things. I mean, I wish I'd recorded that, but that's the way they function. And the final thing so we are going to get bad rules, in my opinion. That's what I'm worried about. And the third one is dispute settlement, which is a crowning point of WTO. Once I have, say, with Chile or Singapore, a bilateral, then also the dispute settlement will be more or less between us. That's the way it's going. It's beginning to happen. It's still some ways to go. At the WTO, even third parties who have some interest in the thing, who are members of the WTO, can actually file briefs, you see, and have standing. Who the hell is going to care what Singapore thinks if Chile is settling with the United States? So the point is, and I'll just end on that note and we can carry on afterwards, and you have my emails. But it is this spillover effect on the two other functions, which are very important, is what worries me, you see, because I think we're in a very fluid state right now. I haven't made up my mind, but these are the kinds of things we worry about. And there's nobody in Washington now because it's completely dominated by lobbies, totally. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. It is a lobbying responsive culture, whether you take Democrats or Republicans. This is our DNA. This is the way our system functions. So there we have to be careful. This is the only place where G1s hopefully are writing in FT, which no longer lets you publish anything on these matters. Or maybe somebody, I finally went to the New York Times again. The editors change, and sometimes you can you can get a little mileage. I wrote one in January in the New York Times, which for 4 years would never publish anything. So there's always flux. Volatility helps. You know, one chef goes away, another one comes. So you've got to keep looking at trying to, you know, put your oar into the water. But I would simply say these are some of the issues, you know, at Columbia also we'll have more discussion of these things and so on. But that's, you know, it's just G1s, universities, where we are not beholden to anybody, any governments and so on. These are the areas where we can keep the kind of discussion, like this one itself is a very important
There we have a message
thing.
for the G20.
Yeah, so I
More
think
discussions like
we
this.
can actually complement what you guys are doing, which I think is to be applauded. But you have constraints which we irresponsible guys don't, and so we can actually, you know, provide some input which is necessary, in my opinion. Okay.
Jagdish, one clarification. I didn't mean to say that climate change and trade are not important. I meant to say in the context of the G21 and the context of the crisis,
Right.
perhaps it's a good idea to focus on one or two issues. And then we have World Bank, ILO, UN,
Right.
WTO
God
to
knows,
continue
yeah.
discussion issues related to trade.
Though I must say I have to write.
Okay, let's take two
Yeah,
questions
okay, I'll read
and then we're going to close. We have one here, the gentleman. Okay, three, no more. You were terrific. Yeah.
Should we share it? Do I have to do it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
The gentleman, yeah.
I'm really interested in your last idea.
I would just like to first thank SIPA and everyone on the panel for the event. But my name is Barry, and I'm actually an undergraduate at Columbia. And I was wondering if perhaps specifically Professor Calvo, but also the other members of the panel could maybe think about sort of the last time we had a financial crisis of anywhere near this magnitude in the late 90s with the Asian financial crisis, and some similarities and differences there. Were there lessons that carry to this crisis and the Lehman incident, and have entities like central banks and the IMF and other international institutions learned and applied those lessons, or are there lessons they're still forgetting and overlooking?
Oh, thank you. I have kind of a big picture question, where this process is heading. I think we can all agree that the world is better off with a G20 than without it. But are we making headway, or are the headwinds blowing us off course? Are we dealing with issue overload? It seems to me if you look at one economy, as this gentleman indicated, and questioning whether a stimulus or austerity was appropriate, if economics doesn't have the answer, then the process becomes political. In terms of the origins of the G20, I think it really began during the last political campaign when George Bush brought in Barack and McCain, and they had a kind of an economic summit in the White House, and then they said, well, let's throw it open to the world, and they convened to Washington. And then each country kind of champions its own issues, and it seems to me the process is it's a process, not you have institutions feeding into the process. So is it just bigger than our ability to manage it at this point? That's my question.
Hello, my name is Christina Bush. I'm a first-year student here at SIPA at the Master of Public Administration program. I have a question for Professor Mohieldin on the role of the G20. The G20 is different from institutions like the World Bank or the IMF in that it is not legitimate and that it does not have enforcement mechanisms like the World Trade Organization, for example. This is something that I'm wondering about. We put a lot of faith into the G20 in solving the crisis. What is your position as a representative of a G187 organization on putting so much responsibility on an organization that can ultimately not enforce its decisions?
Thank you. Okay, the lessons. You want to say something? No. I can say something, but
No, isn't G20 in the process of evolution? I mean, you know, like it has changed over time. So, like the developing countries, like India, for instance, I mean, they rarely, I mean, they went to the banquets, right, as observed. I mean, they were members, but they never chose the menu, right? They were happy to be going along and enjoying the banquets. Now, they're evolving into having some say. Still not with great gusto, but it will grow. So I think it's a study in evolution, right? I mean, I think that's what you would say. Right.
Well, I cannot say better, but well, there is an issue of evolution, and what you mentioned related to well, it's an informal gathering. I wouldn't say it's not legitimate. It's not formal. It's not government. But well, if you borrow from European football, for instance, when there are friendly matches, they never call them friendly. When they do the scoring and the counting, they say, well, did France beat England or Germany or what? So this is always counts, whether that it is in the formal tournament or not. The issue of evolution over time, yes, the invitation coming from the United States back in 2008 was very useful, but I have seen this kind of evolution over time when, since the emerging markets crisis, when they were just invited guests, as Professor Bhagwati mentioned, invited guests to a set menu that they didn't really change any of the items. Now, the vote, there is no vote, but the role and the participation of a country like Indonesia, India, Australia is no less than other countries. And we have seen that some countries, when they get together, like what happened between South Africa and Australia, they can really punch above their weight when they have adopted proposal, and they use the new mechanics of lobbying, not just by weight in the room, but they can really go and send a letter to the Financial Times to be published, signed by the two ministers. Here you have the legitimacy coming from the endorsement of the general public. So there are many new mechanics of getting things done. And being here in this school, I think this is the new reality of how the policies are being formulated. We can always go and say, well, this is the way that the IMF is functioning, this is the way that the World Bank is functioning. Well, we are the G187, but well, when we see 85% of the world getting together and trying to do their best to convince the others to join a particular argument that they see it's good for the world economy at large, well, we'll be following the procedures until they happen. The call for the raise, for instance, of the resources of the fund, basically almost decided there within the G20. But for it to happen, and for the quotas and the votes and the shares and the changes has to be going through the legitimate process within the IMF. The same kind of argument for the World Bank. Talking about the items and finally on this, how would a formal organization composed of governments deal with this? By being active in participation, by being not just invited guests, but being positive in the contribution. And at the same time, in all of the cases, because we have our own board and we have our own governance rules and we have our own accountability as well to our board and to our shareholders, none of these kind of items are basically beyond our mandate. And I can really, I wouldn't make it a big case, but I can really challenge in any of these items that the World Bank is not doing, regardless of the presence of the G20 or not. Having the G20, I totally agree. Being close to the operations, having the G20 is much better for the world today in coordination, collaboration, convergence of ideas, having not just the big leaders meeting once a year, but even having this kind of exchange at the undersecretary levels, at the advisors level, at the senior members of ministries of finance, development, labor, exchanging ideas and being open. This is very much useful in all arguments, including trade, if it is going to be included in the discussion, as Professor Bhagwati would wish.
I think it's very important in order to absorb the lessons, to have a common framework. And that proved very useful in the case of the emerging markets. Emerging markets navigated much better this crisis than other crises. And the reason being that there was a common framework based on research that had been done based on the Argentina crisis, based on Mexico, on Asian crisis, and that made a big difference. And there was a vehicle for that in the case of the Latin American countries, which was the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, that contributed to exchange views under the same framework by bringing together what the G20 is doing. Twice a year, bringing together finance minister and chief economists from central banks. So it's key to have a common framework to dialogue and to talk about these issues. I'm afraid that if some people are thinking that fixed is the way, or other people are thinking flexible is the way, I'm not sure we're going to converge. So I think that's another message. I mean, in particular for the World Bank, they have a role in order to try to come up with one way of viewing things and try to develop a solution. Of course, politics is always there, but my feeling is that these days much is being blamed to policy. I don't know, but I don't know. One last thing, and then we'll close. I think since we have Mohieldin here, and he has recently talked about Islamic finance, I would like him to mention something about it, because it may be one way that seems to be a promising area in this volatile.
It could be promising job opportunities, given the kind of demand on this topic, and it could be worthy as well of a separate talk on it. There is a huge increase now in the interest of Islamic finance for many reasons. Some of them are economic, including lack of trust and the great deal of skepticism now facing capitalism and the capital market solutions. And there are some arguments coming from the politics, given the rise of some movements, especially in some of the Arab countries, the Middle East, and beyond. And some success stories in some countries, including Malaysia, that managed to have practical alternatives to many of the instruments that are there in the conventional financial system. During the last 5 or 7 years, the Islamic finance grew by 10 to 15% per annum. This could be one of the very few things that is growing steadily during the last few years. Now the issue is basically how to make the Islamic financial instruments more related to the real economy, how to make them subject to the rules of corporate governance and international standards, how to make people basically beyond the issue of the religious and cultural aspects, dealing with them because they are becoming a fact of life. 25% of the financial system of Malaysia, around 15% of the financial system in the country like United Arab Emirates, 7% and growing in Turkey. I bet within 2-3 years in countries in the Middle East, whatever is there today is going to be doubled within 4 or 5 years by the growth and the conversions and the easy way of getting that done. What I'm trying to do here is basically understand it, because it's a fact of life. It's 1.2 trillion, not very big if you relate it to the global financial markets. It's around less than 0.6% of the financial assets worldwide. But if it is growing that way, and if it is going to be more significant in some countries, you cannot really ignore it and pretend that's not happening. And if you are seeing some big names in the investment banking activities and the commercial banking activities by some of the high street names in Europe and in the United States are adopting that, you need really to include it in the formula. There have been some growing literature on that, but this is on the financial side. In the real side, some reference to that old book by Weizmann, the Weizmann Share Economy, could be useful as well in understanding how the share contracts and how the risk sharing could be functioning in such an economy. But it's very much in the experimenting phase, but it's growing fast. So for those who are interested in public policies, for those who are interested in the development in markets, for those of you who are going to be working in or on countries that are seeing this kind of growth, I think some early acquaintance with the principles could be useful at this stage. Yep.
Thank you very much, Mahmoud. Well, thank you very much all for coming. As I said, I don't know if we make any headways on this, but at least we had a chance to exchange views on the issue. Thank you very much. Thank you, speakers.